Coming to you from the Hudson Media Group studios, this is Talking Politics, and I am the professor, Fernando Uribe. There's plenty to discuss, so let's get started. Here's what I'm thinking about right now. Folks, it's made its way throughout the news cycle this week, and of course, with being the son of a Cuban mother and having a 101-year-old grandmother who is alive and well, you know what? The topic of Cuba and Bernie Sanders has dominated our news feeds. So let me give you a little bit of context here to sort of unravel what all the hysteria is about. Now, this past week, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and his praise for a 1960s literacy program in Cuba is suddenly at the center of the current 2020 presidential race, with many critics even sort of vilifying him as the self-described Democratic Socialist candidate for the remarks that he's made. Now, here's a look at the literacy program origins and, of course, what has sparked controversy surrounding it today. This past Sunday on 60 Minutes, Senator Sanders sat down with Anderson Cooper, and he talked about, well, quote, when Fidel Castro came into office, you know what he did? He had a massive literacy program. Now, is that a bad thing? Even though Fidel Castro did it? And Sanders even added, it's unfair to simply say that everything in Cuba is bad. Now, critics such as Democratic Florida Representative Donna Shalala accused the senator of singing, quote, the praises of a murderous tyrant like Fidel Castro, though the Vermont Independent has prefaced his original remarks to CBS on Sunday by declaring that he's very opposed to any authoritarian regime not only in Cuba, but around the world. Now, the senator has dismissed any criticism about his comments by politicians such as Shalala and even U.S. Senator Bob Menendez as saying that it's politically motivated. During the recent town hall on Monday on CNN, the senator went on to say, quote, it just so happens to be that supporting other candidates just accidentally, and no doubt, happens to be the case. And that coincidentally, Shalala has not endorsed any candidate during the primary process. Now, again, at this same CNN town hall, Sanders doubled down on his comments, declaring that, quote, I think teaching people to read and write is a good thing. And he condemns sending any dissidents to jail. And as far as the literacy program is concerned, he went on to say, quote, the truth is the truth. So why is the program that's over half a century old so controversial? Well, folks, here's where, as they say, the rubber meets the road. And while Castro and a lot of his supporters and his regime would advocate that it was a literacy program, what it really was, folks, was a re-education program. And that was re-educating the citizens of Cuba to sort of the fundamental goals of communism, and of course the teachings of Karl Marx, and of course the Bolshevik Revolution, which took place in the early 1920s, which converted then Russia into the Soviet Union. And of course that communist state dominated most of Eastern Europe for the rest of the 20th century until the Soviet Union debacled really and went into demise in 1989. Now, of course, supporters of Castro's revolution said that the 8-month-long campaign helped hundreds of thousands of Cubans learn how to read and write. However, though, government opponents say that the 1961 literacy campaign, as I said before, was indeed an indoctrination program that eased the way for Castro's complete takeover of the island. Now, literacy and education have been pillars of Fidel Castro's agenda even before he swept Cuba's military dictatorship. He even wrote about it in January of 1959. During a manifesto he wrote in 1957 specifically, he wrote about the need for, quote, an intensive campaign against illiteracy and civic education, emphasizing the duties and rights of each citizen to his society and fatherland. Well, folks, this is all well and good, and I'm sure that many Bernie supporters throughout this week have had to sort of play damage control about the frontrunner right now in the Democratic Party and during the primary season. Well, folks, let me just give you a little bit more context here about why this is potentially dangerous. And I've talked about it on this program before and on my podcast for many weeks now. Folks, 2020 is indeed a very tribal season, to say the very least. Listen, people are going to take sides. I've talked about it on this program that while I don't like the president as a person, and I have many personal reservations about his character, his demeanor, his lack of decorum while holding the oath of office, folks, the Democratic Party right now is not giving anyone any sort of inspiration, whether it's far-left candidates, whether it's unrealistic goals when it comes to policy and programs, or just sort of the usual rhetoric that the Democratic Party has conveyed for years. That's really where we stand right now. And listen, let me be very clear. You know, I don't like Senator Sanders. I've disliked him long before even these asinine comments about Cuba. Because folks, listen, if the idea is, well, the literacy program got everyone to read and write, but meanwhile, he's oppressing people's human rights and civil rights. There is no free press. There was no freedom of assembly. There's no free speech on the island. So I get it. It's great that everyone can read and write, but at the end of the day, anyone who dissents obviously is going to get a bullet to their head. So I don't know about you. Again, to sort of minimize that and just sort of focus on one positive thing about the regime, I think seems to be a little short-sighted. And I think that's the problem during this campaign season. And specifically as it pertains to Bernie Sanders, listen, I'm going to go on record right now. And I sort of have like a 50-50 sort of percentile when it comes to my perception of the senator from Vermont. 50% of me really believes that the guy means well, that he has good intentions. Yeah, listen, he wants Americans to do better, not only economically, but to have better health care and, of course, have a better quality of life. So I believe him on that front, that he means well, that deep down, I think he really wants to do good for the country. The problem is, though, folks, that the other 50% reminds us that he's economically illiterate. And a lot of these programs that he's suggesting, listen, here's some numbers just to sort of unpackage this a little bit more for you. We're looking at $10 trillion over the next 10 years to fund some of the programs that the senator from Vermont is trying to push for. Now, again, ladies and gentlemen, let me be very clear. Healthcare is important, okay? A healthy population is a good population. Because if we're healthier, guess what? We're not, exhausting resources at our local hospitals. We're not exhausting social services, okay? We're not exhausting the cost of medicine and everything else. So a healthier population is a good thing. Unfortunately, both parties have dropped the ball considerably when it comes to trying to figure out the problem that is healthcare in the United States. But the idea of complete government takeover of healthcare or any other services should concern you, folks. And the reason is, listen, we can look at two specific examples. We can look at the VA, where, yes, under this current administration, we've seen considerable strides being made in the bureaucracy and in sort of like the, really the implementation of better healthcare for our veterans. Now, is the bureaucracy still completely convoluted and effed up? Absolutely. The VA needs considerable more work, all right? But still, we're providing healthcare for our veterans, and even still the government can't get that right. And that's even a small portion of the population. And you expect the government, and you want the government to regulate healthcare for 450 million people? They're not going to be able to do that adequately. Look, and folks, they can't even run the post office, and that's my second example. What a tremendous example of pure government bureaucracy and inefficiency. And this is where people get nervous. Whether it's Democrats from Florida or even our senior senator here in New Jersey, Bob Menendez. And I'll get to a little bit more about what Senator Menendez made reference to as it pertains to Bernie Sanders later in the program. But folks, even Senator Menendez is concerned about some of the policies that Senator Sanders is advocating for and what ultimately could really help bring down this economy. Say what you want, ladies and gentlemen, maybe not here in New Jersey because the cost of living continues to escalate, and that's really at the fault of Governor Murphy and the democratically controlled legislature. But all around the country, and I talk to people nationally, I talk to people in Florida, I talk to people in Michigan, I talk to people in Texas, I talk to people all the way out in California. Job growth is strong. Small businesses are being created. Folks, there has been more money in the pockets of consumers since 2017, when the president, along with Congress, passed the Jobs and Tax Cut Act. Okay? That's undeniable. And I'm not an economist, but you can Google this yourself. All right? The economy right now is strong. Now, it might not be working for everybody, and I understand that. And I get it why Senator Sanders' message resonates with so many working class and poor people in this country. But folks, it's that sort of rhetoric that can become dangerous. Now, I don't want to call Bernie Sanders a communist. I think it's very easy to do that based on the fact that while he doesn't revere authoritarian regimes, he doesn't necessarily throw them under the bus either. And that should be a concern, whether you like Hugo Chavez or Evo Morales or Francisco Maduro or even Fidel Castro or Raul Castro. One thing is to say, listen, you don't believe in tyranny and oppression. But if you're not willing to call out these leaders and just call them out for what they are, that's a problem too. And that could be a problem for the Democratic Party as it pertains to this election. If Bernie is indeed the nominee, folks, it might be hard for him to be at the top of the ticket, and fellow Democrats might have to start worrying about their own seats, both in the House of Representatives and in the United States Senate. Hey, by some miracle of God, if Bernie decides to win the presidency, that might be one thing, but he may have no cooperation in Congress because it looks like him being at the top of the ticket could give Republicans a lot more seats in the House and Senate, and you know what? Nothing will get done during his presidential term. So I don't know, folks, pick your poison. I get it, the president's a very polarizing figure, but do you want a good economy? Do you want good centrist judges? Do you want criminal justice reform and good trade agreements? Or do you want a complete overhaul of our capitalist system, which is what we're faced? It's up to you, ladies and gentlemen. You have many months to decide, but you know where I stand. And as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the comments about Cuba, Senator Sanders should know better. He's alienating a large portion of his Democratic base and just Hispanics and Latinos everywhere, because a lot of us don't like tyranny, a lot of us don't like socialism, and a lot of us don't like communism. And that's what I'm thinking about right now. During this week's edition of the 3-time award-winning podcast, Talking the Hudson, which you can listen to live every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. by going to www.blogtalkradio.com/Talking the Hudson. You can listen to it anywhere and anytime from any PC, Mac, smartphone, or tablet, was the Dean of Hudson County Journalism and my colleague at Insider NJ, the great Al Sullivan. Now, he joined me for over 95 minutes this week on the podcast, and here are some highlights that might pique your attention. First and foremost, the great Al Sullivan talked about sort of the outrage that took place this week during a Bayonne Board of Education meeting as it pertains to the new LGBT curriculum being implemented in all public schools. Now, a law was signed in January of 2019 by the legislature and Governor Murphy to implement LGBT history into our public schools. Now, ultimately, the curriculum will be completely available in all 21 counties and all the school districts by September of 2021. Thus far, the curriculum has been implemented in many counties so far, and even here in Hudson. And residents went to the Bayonne Board of Education meeting to voice their outrage about what this curriculum means. Let's check out what Al had to say as he was in attendance.
But Al, you were there yesterday. Tell me what people were saying during the public portion. What was the pulse you got from people in attendance yesterday in Bayonne?
Well, here's the two officials, and not to be named, pointed out the fact that these are diverse groups. These are mostly religious groups, and they're Orthodox Jews, they're Egyptians, they're Christians, they're Coptic Christians, they're Muslims. And for the first time, this mandate brought them all together onto one side.
Wow.
They were very angry.
Wow.
Okay. They were the pro people were largely students who were under the auspices of one of the gentlemen there, and I really respect the guy, but I mostly don't agree with a lot of his stuff. He's the teacher who's in charge of the Holocaust program. He's in charge of. He was wearing a Black Lives Matter T-shirt. But it was mostly his students who were on the and a couple of activists for the community, for the gay community. They were but they were vastly outnumbered. There were several hundred people there, and many of them spoke. The frustrating part of this was that the board itself, especially the board president, waited till the last moment after all of this everybody spoke to say, well, we're not even going to vote on it because we're mandated, so it's being implemented. And they just walked out. These people were stunned that they didn't have a voice in the community, and they were angry. And it was partly the way it was handled.
Undoubtedly, it was a very sort of heated exchange between many residents and members of the Board of Education. Without a doubt, folks, this is certainly a topic we'll continue to keep an eye on here on the program. Secondly, during the podcast, and another highlight for your attention, Al Sullivan discussed his thoughts about the recent comments by U.S. Senator Bob Menendez as it pertains to Bernie Sanders, and ultimately an open presidential primary here in Hudson County as it pertains to the HCDO. Let's hear what he had to say about it.
Bernie Sanders may say he's not a communist and he doesn't sympathize or revere communists, but I'll tell you something, he's not exactly throwing him under the bus either, bro.
Well, I mean, you look, and this is Menendez is consistent, and and when it comes to Cuba, I think that you get the purest of the pure with him. He's angry. He understood his roots come from there. He understands the kind of horrors that a dictatorship brought out. And he stood up, and to my belief, to his detriment, he got hurt by it. To the Obama, who was the icon of the Democratic Party, over this issue, and Iran, and this shows that Menendez is consistent in standing up for what he believes. I mean, you might say a lot of things negative about Menendez, but that can't be one of them. I mean, I suspect that the Justice Department went after Menendez partly in retribution because he stood up against the president, or unless Obama allowed that to happen. Well, now he's going after someone else with the same issue. It's clear that this is a problem for him, and it's a legitimate concern, and he's consistent. And for that, he should be celebrated. I mean, you know, he hates Trump like everybody, all the other Democrats, but he also isn't going to sell out himself and his basic values just because you know it's a popular thing to do. You know, I don't think he gets the burn.
Without a doubt, it's always a treat to have Al Sullivan on the podcast. And of course, you can listen to the episode in its entirety by going to www.blogtalkradio.com/Talking the Hudson. Again, you can download the episode and listen to it anywhere and any time from any PC, Mac, smartphone, or tablets, whether it's on your commute to work, at the gym, wherever it is. You'll definitely enjoy this week's edition with Al Sullivan on Talking the Hudson. Now to some local stories that might actually, you know what, pique your attention and you should definitely keep an eye out for. Now, getting back to Senator Bob Menendez, he was quoted this week about sort of expressing his disapproval about comments that were made by U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders during a recent interview on 60 Minutes about Cuba and the Fidel Castro regime. And he also talked about, for example, the idea about an open presidential primary in the county. Now, shout out to John Hines with the Hudson County View and all the great journalism that he does over there. But he did talk about an article this week, as a matter of fact, that the senator went very hard at his colleague in the Senate, as a matter of fact, because of the idea that Senator Sanders wanted to say, quote, "It's unfair to say simply everything is bad about the Castro regime. As we all know, Bob Menendez, very much like myself, is a very proud Cuban. And of course, with being a Cuban immigrant, well, of course, being the son of immigrants, of course, and the idea that those comments are not going to sit well with him and other Cubans, not just in Hudson County, but really throughout the country. And the senator really was not shy about expressing his disapproval about his fellow Democrat in the Senate. Now, let me just give you a couple facts here, folks. Quote, the senator went on to say this week, "I'm sure that the hundreds that died in Castro's jails and the over the million who came to the United States and others who are fleeing elsewhere, those who are still languishing in Castro's jails simply because they seek to speak their mind, as we are free to do here in the United States, do not find anything of that regime other than it is a tyrannical one." And of course, the senator did that by, really vilifying Senator Sanders in his comments this week. Quote, "I don't understand how anyone can praise any of that. It's a fundamental challenge as we go into this election season. What does it mean that Senator Sanders sees someone worthy of applauding when you have dictatorships, authoritarian regimes that ultimately deny the civil and human rights of its people?" Of course, the senator from Vermont, as I mentioned before during my opening monologue, got a lot of heat about his comments on 60 Minutes, and of course, as he was forced to defend it during the recent debate in South Carolina leading up to the presidential primary this week in South Carolina, of course. And one of the things that folks, Senator Menendez went on to say, quote, is that Sanders is not his preference to challenge the president regarding the Democratic ticket and ultimately this November. Because again, he's sort of asking how he would pay for Medicare for all or free college, or even expressing disappointment that he didn't vote for any sort of comprehensive immigration reform. Now, still, the senior senator from New Jersey has told many media outlets this week that he isn't backing any presidential candidate at this time, but noted that this is why his suggestion of an open presidential primary here in the county should at least make somewhat of sense. Now, again, just to give you a little bit more detail here, listen, he went on to say, quote, "This way from Senator Booker, who's up for re-election, all those council members who are also up for re-election, to all state and county officials who may be up also for re-election, guess what? They won't be affected by whoever, whether it's Senator Sanders or anyone else." Folks, I've talked about this before, whether it's today during the monologue or even previous episodes. Listen, the senator here in New Jersey has a legitimate concern about what Senator Sanders means at the top of the ticket. And let me just sort of unravel this for you so you can sort of get a perspective. Folks, when you go into the voting booth and you close that curtain and you look at the screens and you decide what buttons to press, there are a lot of Democrats in Hudson County, maybe throughout New Jersey, even throughout the country. Okay, they're going to look at, let's say Bernie Sanders is the candidate, and he's going to be at the top of the ticket. And of course, on the opposite column is President Donald Trump. You know what's going to happen to a lot of people? Now, listen, maybe you and I and a lot of my informed audience take the time to do their homework and read up on candidates. But you know what many voters just tend to do? They tend to go in there, they look at a candidate, and they just press that button, and guess what? They just vote all the way down the column. And that's what Senator Menendez is concerned about. Because here in New Jersey, listen, it's a predominantly very dependable blue state. So short of some catastrophe or some scandal, it's a pretty safe bet that Cory Booker will be reelected as a United States Senator here in the state of New Jersey. Again, the machine is really strong, not just in Hudson County, but throughout the state in terms of getting the vote out for Booker. But of course, even in some House races, that might not be the case. So whether New Jersey might be an anomaly, but throughout the rest of the country, folks, the idea that you walk in there and you close a curtain, and you may not like Bernie Sanders, and you might say to yourself, you know what, I don't like the president. Man, he really rubs me the wrong way, but I can deal with him. I'll tolerate him for another 4 years. And you know what's going to happen? You're going to go down that line and ultimately not only reelect the president, but you're going to give a lot of plurality to Republican candidates that are going for House seats and for any Senate seats across the country. And that could ultimately remove a lot of Democrats out of power. And again, so that's where Senator Menendez is coming from. He's vehemently concerned about his own party's stake in this election. Because again, there's a very real possibility, folks, that based on the fact that Sanders could be at the top of the ticket, a lot of House, Democrats might lose their seats. Maybe not here in New Jersey. And for the most part, a lot of the current representatives in the House are safe here in the Garden State. But throughout the rest of the country, a lot of Democrats are vulnerable. A lot of Democrats are vulnerable in their own Senate seats. And if Bernie's at the top of the ticket, you know what? Who's to say that people will just vote for the president and just vote all the way down that column? And guess what? That'll help the plurality of not only Republicans in the United States Senate, who currently hold a 54 to 46 margin right now in the Senate. And even though the Republicans are at the disadvantage in the House, they might win that back in a tremendous landslide. So the senator is very concerned as to what the effect that Bernie Sanders will have on the Democratic Party. Again, for those of you that maybe are staunch supporters of the president, hey, maybe you want to see a complete overhaul of power in both Congress and, of course, to keep the president, in the White House. I don't know, folks, a lot remains to be seen, and we'll see what happens in South Carolina, and of course, coming up on Super Tuesday. But without a doubt, Bernie Sanders has a lot of support and momentum, and that scares a lot of establishment Democrats to death. In a story that I've covered in previous weeks, and ultimately affecting not only Hudson County residents, but residents throughout the state of New Jersey, it was decided that at the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals this past week, that indeed the Trump administration can withhold millions of dollars in federal law enforcement grants from sanctuary cities and states that don't cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. Now, here's a little bit of, a little language here to sort of unravel what's been going on. Now, 7 states and New York City have indeed sued the U.S. government after the Department of Justice in 2017 declared it would withhold funds from cities and states that don't give immigration enforcement officials access to jails or notices when undocumented migrants are scheduled to be released from jail. Now, again, this was reported during the sort of the news that rundown from the AP this week. And folks, the big picture really is that the decision really conflicts with the rulings of other federal appeals courts. And it comes amid sort of an ongoing dispute between the president, the Attorney General, the Justice Department in Washington, and of course, sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, for example, here in New Jersey, as it pertains to Governor Murphy and Attorney General Uribe. Ladies and gentlemen, this should not surprise anybody. The idea that Governor Murphy and Uribe were attempting to spit in the face of federal law, at some point they had to believe this was going to come back to bite them where. Now, again, there are some current injunctions that might delay the implementation of this court decision this week from taking place. But without a doubt, ladies and gentlemen, this is where, again, we get into this conflict about federalism and states' rights. I'm sure that the governor and Attorney General Grewal are very concerned about New Jerseyans, and of course, listen, let's be honest, they bend over backwards for illegals in the state, so that shouldn't surprise anybody. But did they really think that with the new administration and specifically with an Attorney General at the time, Jeff Sessions, under the guidance of President Trump, would indeed be as soft as the previous president was when it came to federal immigration law? Listen, one thing, folks, is when Barack Obama was known as the deporter-in-chief, and one thing was deporting more people that were here illegally than any other president before him and even after him. Okay, even President Trump is nowhere near the numbers that President Obama was when it came to deportations. Now, again, the president made it a point when he was a candidate to run on a platform of enforcing federal immigration law and to make sure that sanctuary cities and states no longer continue that practice. So it shouldn't surprise anyone, folks, that the courts sided with the federal government here as it pertains to these policies that ultimately are hurting New Jerseyans and hurting Americans all across the country. We'll keep you posted about what happens with this case, but without a doubt, folks, it's certainly a victory for the president, for Attorney General Bill Barr, and for Americans like myself that believe in the rule of law. Moving down south to Bayonne once again, and of course, another excellent job by John Hines at the Hudson County View reporting on this story. But many speakers during the recent Bayonne Board of Education meeting voiced their feelings on the school district's implementation of the LGBT history curriculum that's based on a mandate by Governor Phil Murphy, and of course, a mandate that will be administered in all public schools throughout the state, ultimately to its conclusion in September of 2021. Let me just give you some facts here just to sort of remind you about what this story is about. Now again, the bill was signed into law in January of 2019, which, quote, requires boards of education to include instruction and adopt instructional materials that accurately portray political, economic, and social contributions of persons with disabilities and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Now, according to the bill, incorporating the history of disabled people and the people of the LGBT community into social studies curriculum is for the benefit of Bayonne students. Now, members of the Board of Ed vehemently defended the curriculum, and while they didn't take a vote on it, ultimately, many residents and even some religious groups went during the public portion to voice their opposition. Now, folks, I've talked about this on many occasions where it's been interviewing members of the LGBT community on my podcast, whether it's been from Hudson Pride, the leading LGBT advocacy organization here in Hudson County, or even Garden State Equality with my podcast with Insider NJ, where I've interviewed advocates from all over really New Jersey about this curriculum. Now, folks, listen, I understand that many parents are concerned about what this curriculum means. All right, now it's my understanding that this curriculum will only be relegated to high school students. It will not be filtering its way down to the middle school and even elementary school level. And listen, I get it. Some parents are concerned about it. Now, whether or not you agree with their decision, they're still parents. Okay, I don't have any kids that I know of. But at some point when I do, I might want to have a say in what my kids are learning and the curriculum that's being taught to them in the public schools. I don't have an issue with this per se, folks. I mean, I'm an advocate and certainly someone who is a champion for the LGBT community in New Jersey. I advocate for their causes. I've certainly gone to events. I've had them on my podcast. I'm an advocate for them because I know that they're marginalized, okay? Folks, listen, there are plenty of reasons to dislike Fernando Uribe, but disliking because I'm straight, guess what? That's something I'm never, ever going to experience in life. But you know what? Who does face scrutiny? People who are gay, people who are transgendered, people who are bisexual, people who are lesbians and identify that way. They continue to be marginalized. They continue to face prejudice and bigotry that I'm never going to know. So I understand where they're coming from when it comes to trying to advocate for this sort of curriculum. But folks, the problem is we've become so tribal that even parents that oppose this, even in the slightest, are called bigots, are called homophobes, and are called transphobes. That's just wrong. Let's have a dialogue where parents can even agree to disagree about the curriculum, but maybe they can have more of a say. But the idea that we're just shutting down any dissent about it, that's not healthy, and that's not democracy. So again, folks, many residents went to Bayonne and went to the Board of Ed to sort of voice their opposition. Now, what happens in the weeks and months ahead when this ultimately comes to a vote, and whether or not parents will continue to raise hell about it, remains to be seen. But we'll certainly keep you posted here on the program about these ongoing developments. And that's our show for this week. To check out all the excellent programming, folks, offered by the Hudson Media Group and NJ On Air, check out their websites, www.hmgtvshows.com, www.livestream.com/hmgtv, and www.njonair.com. Don't forget to like the Hudson Media Group and NJ On Air on Facebook, and don't forget to follow them on Instagram and Twitter. And don't forget, live every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you can listen to the 3-time award-winning podcast, Talking the Hudson, by going to www.blogtalkradio.com/Talking the Hudson from any PC, Mac, smartphone, or tablet. Once again, folks, if we're talking politics, we're doing it right here with the Hudson Media Group. I'm Fernando Uribe. Thank you so much for watching.
Don't forget to catch Fernando's podcast at blogtalkradio.com/talkonthehudson. New episodes available every Wednesday night at 9 p.m.